the difference between old imperialism and the new imperialism that's going to develop from 1880 to 1914. So the dates that are on the screen are for new imperialism, ranged from 1880 to 1914, and essentially stops with the start of World War I. So old imperialism, let's take a step back for a second. Old imperialism, as I'm going to call it, occurred from the 1500s to the 1700s. And during old imperialism, European powers did not usually acquire territory. They actually instead set up trading posts. The most obvious examples are places like in Africa and Asia. In these areas, there was a relationship created between the people, the inhabitants of the continent, and the European countries, so that trading could occur. But there was not a wholesale movement, for the most part, of individuals from the European country to the new areas in Africa and Asia. Portugal, for example, is going to set up trading posts on the west coast of Africa, India, and Indonesia, and they would be responsible for starting the spice trade. They would also be responsible for the slave trade that would begin to the New World and would be taken over later by Great Britain. The Netherlands will also set up trading posts in Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Again, Europeans usually respected and cooperated with local rulers in India, China, and Japan. So here's a map of Africa in 1880 prior to new imperialism beginning. And for the most part, you can see where Portugal and Britain have set up trading posts. And you can also see that for the most part, they haven't gone into, at this point, into the center of places like Africa. The exception is Egypt, up near the Suez Canal, because of its importance in trade, and we'll talk about that as an exception. Old imperialism does have an exception, and it's a pretty big exception, but it's in relationship to the New World. So the New World is really much more like new imperialism than old imperialism. The New World is where Spain is going to create an enormous empire that spans from Central and South America, and they're going to claim large portions of the western part of North America. Native Americans are going to be severely subjugated and sometimes even enslaved. So again, this is actually more like the new imperialism that we're going to be talking about than what was on the previous slide. Portugal is going to make Brazil a sugar colony and essentially import massive slaves after they are responsible for the deaths of the native inhabitants. And England is going to colonize the east coast of North America and set up its 13 colonies. And then you have France colonizing Canada and Haiti. So old imperialism is mainly about setting up trade networks. The exception is the New World. So the New World, again, is more like what we're going to see happening in Africa and Asia. But what happens in Africa and Asia doesn't change until the 19th century, whereas the New World had been taken over much sooner. The New World actually, in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, they're all getting their freedom. So that means then that Europe is going to have to look elsewhere. European migration is a big reason for this new form of colonialism that's going to occur, or this new form of imperialism, I guess is another term for it. From 1815 to 1932, more than 60 million people are going to leave Europe. This has a lot to do with the economic crises of the time, a lot to do with the movements towards liberalism. So migrants usually went to European inhabited areas, areas where Europeans already were. So that would essentially keep them away from Africa and Asia and have them going over to the New World where they already had colonies set up. This is another reason for more expansion. Most immigrants are going to be, during this time, poor and from rural areas who are in need of jobs. This map, I believe, is in your book, or this graph that shows the where the Europeans are going for the most part. And you can see pretty much the United States, a couple other places, but pretty much they're mostly leaving England and Italy, and they're pretty much going to the United States, some also in South America. So the new imperialism. New imperialism is going to begin in 1880s in Africa. It's actually a little earlier in Asia. What do you need to know about it? In the 1800s, Europeans controlled 7% of the world's territory, but by 1914, they're going to control 84%. So huge change. British alone is going to control 25% of the world's population and be 20% of the actual world's territory or land. Queen Victoria, when she is ruling during this time period, is related to saying, or she said, that the sun never set on the British Empire because there was always a colony where the sun was up. Europeans used force to control their local governments and then exploited the local economies for whatever raw materials they might have. Britain's control over Egypt in the 1880s is going to be the model for new imperialism and is going to be that first inroad into setting up a true protectorate or colony in Africa, and then it will spread to a lot of other European countries scrambling to get their piece of territory. So Britain in Egypt, as our first example, Egypt was originally controlled by Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and in 1849 they controlled this area. They are going to attempt to get a canal built that will increase trade and get trade over into Asia. The canal is going to open in 1869, and the way that they got this built is foreign investors in Britain and France wanted to get this canal built so that they could trade with the Far East. So they're not satisfied with the management that is occurring in this new canal. So they are going to buy up, specifically Britain's going to buy up significant portions of shares in the company that runs the canal in 1875, and as a result they're going to feel like they are in charge of this whole area. So by 1883 Britain is going to declare Egypt a protectorate, meaning I'm going to protect you. It's a very paternalistic way of looking at imperialism or taking over another country. So this protectorate was supposed to be temporary. The Suez Canal and its ability to allow trade to move much faster is the main motivation. But Egypt during this time period is still technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but Britain somehow just swept in and took it over. So Britain will control this area from 1883 all the way until 1956, after World War II. So what are the motives for new imperialism versus old imperialism? Some of them are pretty similar, but old imperialism is noted for the motives of gold, going over to get those gold and silver, you can put on there, glory, just for the idea of exploring, the great humanistic idea of exploration, and then for God, for this Christianizing missionary impulse. So you've got gold, glory, and God, the three G's for old imperialism. New imperialism, on the other hand, has some new motivations. So commerce, trade, natural resources. So not just gold, but other natural resources, plus new markets in order to trade the things that have been made from this industrial revolution. So commerce is one. Civilization, this idea that one nation is greater than another, and that there is a responsibility by these great European nations that are industrialized to civilize the rest of the world. Again, a social Darwinistic kind of attitude. And then the last one is Christianity. So God's there both times. Some people are going over there for really very noble reasons, going places like Africa and Asia. Others are there primarily as economic motivation. So commerce, I think, really one of the main reasons that the Europeans went. New markets and raw materials. They've got surplus goods from the Industrial Revolution, and they believe that they can sell them in these new areas. They actually find this to not be necessarily the case as they go to places like Africa. No one wants to dress like a Victorian subject from England. The new markets, for the most part, are too poor to buy the goods, or the goods are not relevant to the climate and where they live. Germany's trade with colonies is actually only 1% of its total trade, to just give you an idea. France imports more goods than it sells to its colonies. So again, it's really the colonies, they're taking stuff from the colonies, not as much giving stuff to the colonies or even selling stuff in the colonies. So they're looking for raw materials, ivory and rubber in the Congo, diamonds in South Africa, cocoa from Niger, tea from China, cotton from India, and spices from Indonesia. They're also going to set up new military bases in these regions to, quote, protect their interests. So Britain is concerned by French and German land grabs in the 1880s, and so there's a lot of kind of vying for power. So Britain is going to respond by having by putting military interests throughout this area so that they can make sure that there is not, that free trade is allowed to reign, and that these other countries aren't able to come in and increase the trade tariffs, because that would make it more expensive for Britain and other countries. Again, this whole time period is going to increase the tension between the European countries, which is going to, again, help to start World War I. Civilization is another reason the Europeans went over to places in Africa and Asia during this new imperialism. Ideology, first, this belief of nationalism, that your country is great, and one of the ways that you show that your country is great is by conquering others, and social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest and this idea of social Darwinism was promoted by Herbert Spencer, but it was based on the original ideas of Charles Darwin relating to species and to evolution. There's a poem that comes out by Rudyard Kipling that you're going to be reading called The White Man's Burden, and you'll be looking more closely in class at this actual advertisement for a type of soap that is related to imperialism, and you can just, it's incredibly racist. Christianity is another reason for Europeans going over to Africa and Asia. A lot of them just accompanied the other more economic reasons for going. So Christian missionaries often accompanied companies as they traveled over there and used the resources when they got over there to actually spread their faith. So there's religious revivalism in the middle class with Victorian values during the mid-1800s, and that's going to spread to these new places in Africa and Asia. Missionary activities are more successful in actually sub-Saharan Africa than they are in Northern Africa. Northern Africa is, again, dominated by the Ottoman Empire at some time, and you have a Muslim population there. Dr. David Livingstone is the first white to do humanitarian and religious work in South and Central Africa, and he is essentially a rock star during this time period. People are very interested in him and his writings and stuff, and he eventually goes missing. And so Henry Morton Stanley is another writer, a newspaper reporter who actually goes to Africa looking for him. Henry Morton Stanley will be essential for going all the way across Africa and mapping it out so that other European countries can come in and take over parts of Africa. He also is able to find Dr. David Livingstone, and because he's the only white man in Africa during this time period, there's this quote where he comes up to Livingstone and says, "Livingstone, I presume." And of course it was Livingstone. He was having such a great time living with the Africans and stuff that he didn't want to come back. Henry Morton Stanley will begin working for a pretty horrible man named Leopold II. He's the King of Belgium, and he is going to help Leopold II to explore the Congo region and to sign treaties where they essentially give up the tribal leaders in the Congo give up their rights to land to Belgium. That's it, you guys. You're done. Enjoy.